Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to jump right into the program since I know that we have a very full conversation ahead of us. If you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat just where you're calling in from today, it's always kind of fun to see, where everybody's from all over the world. And I am Derek Hosberg. I am the program director at Reimagine, and I am calling in from New York City today. I wanted, just for those who are new to Reimagine, we are a nonprofit organization that sparks experiences like this one that empower individuals, communities, families to face some of the hardest parts of our existence, including illness and death, while inspiring people to celebrate life and one another. And before we get started with our conversation with Allison Gilbert and Megan Devine, I'm just going to do a few things. First off, I just wanted to extend a huge lot of gratitude to Domani for their support of this, Domani for Grief for their support of the series. I also wanted to thank our 2021 sponsors for Reimagine, who also help support these types of free events. And I also just wanted to say thank you to anybody who has donated to Reimagine. All of those small donations make a huge impact and enable us to continue to do free programming. And then I'm sure most of you, if not all, are familiar with Zoom. I just wanted to note that I do have the closed captioning enabled. And if you want to see it, you can just click that little CC at the bottom. We do encourage you to share questions, comments in the chat throughout the event. And if the chat, though, is distracting to you, you can always click that little arrow at the top and close that window. And with that, I'm going to introduce our wonderful host today, Allison Gilbert, who is the author of numerous books, including the much anticipated forthcoming biography of Hearst newspaper columnist Elsie Robinson, which is to be published by Basic Books, an imprint of Hachette Book Group in 2022. Her latest book, Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive, reveals creative ways to remember family and forget a family and friends we never want to forget. And I would just encourage you to take a moment to actually follow Allison if you haven't already done that on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And she's everywhere as a Gilbert writer. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Allison.
Hey everybody, thank you so much, Dara. Thank you, Reimagine and Domani for Grief for supporting this conversation series. We do this every month, the last Thursday of every month, and it's something that I really look forward to. I take great pleasure in planning these events and choosing my guests. And when I asked Megan Devine to join us today, I crossed my fingers hoping that she would say yes, because I'm a fangirl. I look to her for her heart. I look to her for her warmth and her leadership in the grief space. I'm not going to do a formal introduction. You will learn all about her in the questions that I ask, but I will start just with a little bit of housekeeping. If you do join me the last Thursday of every month, you know I take this job seriously. Part of that is making sure you are all heard and your questions are answered. So how we do that is that I will ask you to put your questions in the chat. Christina, who works with me, say hi, Christina. Okay, good. There you go. She will go through the chat and see which questions really are applicable to the most people. And that way we can get through that much more in a very careful scaffolded kind of way. So we will do that at about the half an hour mark, more or less. I'm also very good about time. I know in New York, it's a little bit after 1 o'clock. Maybe you're on your lunch break. Maybe you have kids who are napping. Maybe you have elementary school kids who are going to come home, any minute from a half day program, if you're so lucky. Or maybe you're taking the time out of your work day to join us. Regardless of what's going on in your life, I promise you that we will be done at the top of the hour. I honor your time. If you do need to step away, just know that we're recording this conversation. So no pressure. You can go away, get a drink of water, come back, and if you miss anything, you're more than welcome to get the replay, which we will send to you. You don't have to hunt for it. We will email it to you tomorrow. So that's all I have for housekeeping. And I'm just going to jump right in. So Megan, I just want to take a deep breath and just say thank you for lending yourself to us today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start somewhere just really personal
Mhm.
first. I know that we had suggested that for folks who registered for today's event, that they could watch the free documentary that you helped create. You were on the advisory board of Speaking Grief. We are going to get to that film. It's fabulous. But I want to start a little bit backwards of how you became a psychotherapist. Originally, grief was not what your focus was. It was substance addiction. There was focus on abuse. And with permission, it was something very personal that happened to you with your partner, Matt, that made you pivot. And I'm wondering if you can start us there.
Sure. So I have been a psychotherapist for it's 20 years this year, which is kind of crazy. And I had been in private practice for a long time. And as you said, my practice was really focused on a lot of the crappy things that happen to us in life, right? So I worked with a lot of trauma and addiction and previous childhood abuse, interpersonal challenges, all of those sort of um, difficult parts of life. So when I say that grief wasn't new to me, I mean that I was already sort of in the trenches with all of those messy, difficult parts of life. And I tell this part of the story because I was tired being in private practice and listening to people's stories day in and day out. I needed a break. And so Matt and I were talking about my closing my practice, and he was going to take over financial support of our family so that I could take a break and spend some time really listening to myself to find out what I wanted next for myself. Unfortunately, we never got to do that because within 3 days of that conversation, Matt drowned. I quit my practice. I never saw my clients again. And I actually swore that I would never go back to the field. What I experienced as a grieving person being thrown into that world of sudden accidental death. I was 38 at the time, and Matt was 39. The world was so harsh and sharp and unwelcoming. There was no way that I thought I could ever re-enter the world as a human, let alone as a therapist. So how do I say this? I spent the probably the first 2 years after Matt died writing and being out in nature. I volunteered on a dairy farm so that I could be as far away from humans as possible. Cows don't care if you cry on their bellies. They really don't care, right? And at that time, I mean, it seems strange to think about now. This was in 2009. Back then, there weren't the amount of resources that there are available now. Like even blogs weren't really a thing quite back then. So finding people who understood, who didn't sort of run away with that horrified look on their face or show up with platitudes and tell me that I would get married again really quickly, like that's obnoxious. Um,
Well, what I'm going to
support, yeah,
interrupt you
of course, do it.
kindly to
I can
say
ramble, so you should interrupt me.
no. What I want to harp on, or at least focus on, or glom onto, is what you said about platitudes.
Mhm.
And there's something that, and I have a quote because I want to make sure that I get it right about who you are and what you believe in and why you do the work that you do. You have written, grief is a natural response to death and loss. It is not an illness to be cured or a problem to be solved. And the reason why I chose to kind of interject right then and there is that there is a belief system that many well meaning friends and family may have, that this is a time bound process
Mm,
and we should be moving on, or your loved one's in a better place, and all
yeah.
sorts of what you call platitudes. And I'm wondering how that philosophy of yours has taken root
Mm.
in all of the work that you do.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a good segue from the personal story because the reason that I came back, the reason that I do the work that I do is because I lived this experience. Literally the night of Matt's memorial, I had people coming up to me and telling me that I should get married again as soon as possible, and that that was their biggest wish for me. That Matt wouldn't want me to be sad, that I was smart, that I would have this beautiful life. And like, I just watched the man drown 3 days ago. We have this sort of rabid fixation on fixing people, right? And that comes from our discomfort and our awkwardness or our fear of being awkward. We think it's our job to fix somebody's pain. That is the story that we've been taught, and that story is wrong, right?
You actually created perfect segue to this short, not speaking grief. We are going to
Mhm.
get to that documentary, but this wonderful illustrated video that really is about exactly what you're just talking about. So I
Mhm.
do want to show this clip so if everyone
Yeah,
can watch it. It's only, I think it's less than 5 minutes long, but boy, is it worth it.
we'll be right here when you get back.
So, what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up. But here's what we tend to do instead. "You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them." Or, "You know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off." Or, "I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture?" We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
Megan, I have always loved that.
Mm.
How did you create it? Who was your intended audience? And what do you think the effect has been since it's been released?
I love that animation. So that, gosh, when did we release that? I think we released that in, it was probably 2018, I think, when we released that. And the way that I talk about that animation and animation in general is, how do you get people to talk about things they try to avoid? Well, you do it by making things adorable, right? You have to make things a little bit more friendly and safe for people to enter into stuff that they normally try to keep at arm's length. So getting just that little piece of public information, public service announcement, getting people to be curious about, how do I usually respond when somebody's in pain around me? Oh, maybe that's not working and I should try something different. Like, I wanted something succinct and adorable and actionable, right? I think my perspective as an educator is, I always want people to be curious and to think about, what am I doing? What am I saying? Oh, wait, is this actually helping the way that I think it's helping, right? I don't want to always tell people what to do, although I am kind of bossy. Um, what I really want is for people to be curious and sort of look under the hood of the ways that we normally talk to each other and check, like, if my intention is to make somebody feel heard and supported, is what I'm doing actually getting us there? If not, how do I adjust my course so that I can deliver the love I actually want to deliver? I want people having those thoughts internally all the time, because even though this work, the documentary, the books, this animation, um, sort of come from a place of grief related to death, these are interpersonal skills that we need every single day. Does what we intend actually land that way? Yeah.
I love the fact that you are an educator, that you are a teacher. The next part of our conversation, I do want to talk about Speaking Grief, your film.
Mm,
But first, because we talked about resources, I want to remind people, they saw the name of your company, Refuge in Grief, of course, in that slate, but you are all over social media as Refuge in Grief. So, Refuge in Grief on Facebook, Refuge in Grief on Twitter and Instagram. Just wanted to remind people there are also lots of wonderful resources. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Domani for Grief. Also has wonderful free resources on its website too. Also courses if you're interested in taking those. But let me get now to the documentary.
mhm.
It is tight. It is short. It's not a 2-hour slog. It is a 1-hour soup to nuts experience. And I'm wondering in the chat, who put in the chat if you actually wrote it, if you did not wrote it, but if you actually watched it, who did their homework for today. I'm just really curious if how many people did. I did. I actually watched it a number of times. And there's one part of Speaking Grief, this documentary, but by the way, you can watch it for free. And we'll put in the chat how you can access it if you haven't done it yet. But I see a ton of people have watched it. Yes, that's awesome. If you had seen it, you saw that in the film, and we're going to show just a screen grab of it. In the beginning and at the end, a very effective tool that you use, and we're going to just stop here on this one image first, is the label that people in the film wear. Can you describe what we're seeing in this screenshot, Megan?
Sure. In this screenshot, there is a woman who has a black t-shirt on that says daughter. You can't see the whole thing. You could see after, but it says daughter. And then a younger child standing next to them, and their shirt says sister on it. And what we wanted to do with both the open and the open and closed sequence for Speaking Grief was to have a visual representation of relationship and relatedness. There are sort of two things going on here. There's some other images in the TShirt series, as we call it, that are out in the world, and you just get to see a little peek of the person's, the relationship of the person they lost.
I'll show that slide next, just because if we can advance it, you could see someone out in the wild wearing.
Out in the wild, there you go.
Yep.
What we wanted to do was have a visual representation, one of relatedness and connection, and two of grief walking around in the world, right? You might see somebody, this one is the grocery store, you might see somebody at the grocery store who's standing there with a bag of chips in their hand crying, and in one part of your brain you might be like, what's wrong with them? But in this image, like, you can make some good guesses, right? Because he's standing there with the word son on his chest, and we're watching Speaking Grief, so we can make that inference that his son died or their son died, and he's feeling it in that moment, right? So we wanted to be able to visually represent grief out in the world. There's a quote that goes around sometimes with like, be nice to everybody because everybody's carrying a heavy load. Now I'm really snarky, and I always think like, was I not being nice? Like, that's just me. But this is really something that the Speaking Grief Initiative wanted to do, was to start making conversations about grief happen in daily life, because grief exists in daily life.
What I really love most about this TShirt series, as you have called it, is that I know after both of my parents died, my grief to those out in the wild was, of course, invisible, right? I didn't have, nor do we all wear, the labels, which of course is what this is speaking to, which makes conversations happen, which allows people the ability to share, but we don't know what's happening in other people's lives. So how does this representation fuel discussion, do you think? And Christina, before Megan answers, can you go back to that other image where we see the parent and the child? You know, we all wear these labels, is really what I'm saying. I feel like I could wear the daughter label for both of my parents, because I still feel that I bring that with me where I go, and I haven't been their daughter in that literal sense since they've both been gone for so long. So help us understand how we take this representation and we use it as fuel that can support us.
One thing I would say is that you're always somebody's daughter. The length of time doesn't change that, right? Everybody does get to decide their own language for themselves, but I want to reflect that back, that time doesn't change relationship or relatedness. What I love about this series, and I love that we came back to this particular image of the daughter and the sister, very often lost is the elephant in the room, right? Especially within families where you're like, I'm not really sure how to talk to my kid about this. I don't want them to see me too sad. There's a whole bunch of panic and concern about how we talk about things as families, and that is for birth families and chosen families and the wider social family, right? How do we start having these conversations? And for me, I think it starts with acknowledging that there is something to talk about, right? And the point or the purpose, the foundation of the Speaking Grief project, and when I say project or initiative, I'm talking about the documentary itself, but also on speakinggrief.org, you can find a whole bunch of supplemental information and conversation starters, because this was always bigger than just this amazing documentary. It was really, is really meant to open conversations, to sit down and watch the program with other people, and then use it as a starting place, use it as a way to sort of grease those awkward wheels, right? Like if you're just at breakfast with somebody, you're like, so I want to talk about grief, right? Maybe a little bit awkward, but with something like the documentary, there are so many places that you can start a conversation, and having a place to begin makes it a lot easier. So again, coming back to this visual representation of relationship, that's a really cool and somewhat simple place to start, right? Like, what shirt would you wear, right?
As one aspect of the documentary struck you after, as it's been digested by audiences, as resonating the most? What has been the
Mm,
response that's been perhaps the most surprising or the most gratifying?
gosh, I think, and I don't want to speak for Lindsay, who's the producer, because I bet that they have a different answer, but I know that all of us are just really, really proud of the work and proud of the families and the way that the team came together to put this out into the world. And I feel like what we really hoped for was to serve the mission, which was to start conversations. And that is what we've heard has happened, right? We've heard from church groups and other organizations that have hosted movie nights, usually pre-pandemic. I mean, unfortunately, the release date for Speaking Grief was early March of 2020. So we missed a lot of the publicity tours that we were going to do and a lot of the public events that we had planned. But people did do sort of virtual watch parties, and the feedback that we got from that was this was such a good way to start these conversations. And similarly to what I said earlier about that, how to help a grieving friend animation, we make difficult things easier by making them adorable, or by giving people an external framework from which to start, right? And so speaking grief acts in that way as well, that there are so many anchors, so many solid points that you might bring up sort of to test the waters with conversation, or as a jumping off point for different conversations. So I think that for me has been so gratifying about the way that Speaking Grief has moved into the world, is it's doing what we hoped it would do, which is to start conversations.
We are at the half-hour mark, so I wanted to make sure that if you do have questions about Speaking Grief, if you have questions about Megan and her work, this is your time to make sure that your questions go in the chat. I'll ask her one more question before we dive in, so you still have time. And a reminder, Megan is everywhere under Refuge in Grief: Facebook,
Everywhere.
Twitter, and Instagram.
Everywhere.
And
Yeah.
you're
Mhm.
everywhere.
That's right.
And we're all Megan fans, so please do follow her. Again, if you want other resources, if you are feeling that you are in need of more support in addition to Megan's resources, please check out what's on the Damani for Grief website. I think you'll find the resources there also very helpful. But Megan, another resource that is more new perhaps than the documentary is your journal, How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed.
Yeah.
And I love the name of your journal. Tell us about the journal, and then I'm going to go into the well, or Christina will go into the well of the chat. But tell us about your journal, How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed.
Yeah. How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed is the sort of the action guide journal workbook. Um, jumping off point from the first book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. So It's Okay That You're Not Okay is really sort of the treatise, right? Like, you're not crazy. This terrible thing happened, and things really are as bad as you think they are. And what I wanted to do with How to Carry, which is the workbook that just came out this year, is I wanted to give people room, space to explore the things they learned, the things they realized, the things that they're frustrated by, anything that has come up either out of reading It's Okay or just out of being a grieving person out in the world. There aren't enough places where we can let ourselves tell the truth about our own experience, and I wanted the journal to be a beautiful, useful place to do that.
I love it. I
Yeah.
really, I'm so glad we got to be able to share it again here to make sure that everyone who is on this call live and those who watch it in the future know that it exists, because it's a wonderful, valuable journal to have,
Yeah.
um, to grab for. So
Yeah,
I'm
it's a
going,
really great one. I want to make one
yeah,
comment about books,
yeah.
about mine, but also about any books. Some of you may or may not have heard that the publishing industry is having a lot of shipping delays. Books are going out of stock. If you've had your eye on my books or Allison books or any other books, now is the time to get them, preferably from your independent booksellers, because if you're waiting for holiday gifts, it's going to be really tough. So, public service announcement: get your books now. The journal How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed is available in paperback. It's also available digitally, though, if you wanted to have your own fancy notebook and do it that way. So I hate it when people want to go get a resource and it's not available through no fault of mine or theirs or anybody else's. So get your books now.
Yeah, no procrastination. You heard it from Megan Devine.
That's right.
All right, Christina, I'm going to throw it to you.
Okay, our first question is, how do you approach your boss or work to tell them you're not ready to go back to work yet?
That is such a good question. So I have several very long answers, and I'm going to try to not do very long answers so we can get to a bunch of questions. I think a good way to start that conversation is to almost say what you just asked, right? So if you message your team leader or your boss or your HR department and say, I need to have a conversation about when I feel ready to come back and do my job. Can we make a time to talk about that? Right? You don't have to have a fully mapped out solution or idea or a map of how you're going to have that conversation or what you're going to say. You can start with, I need to have this conversation. When would be a good time to do that? Right? How they respond to you is going to give you more information. They might say, you're coming back, I don't care. Well, that's useful information, because you don't want to come into a conversation blind at that, right? And then if you have you're going to get that conversation set up beforehand, I would do some prep work for yourself and maybe write down, here are the things that I'm willing to do, the things I'm not willing to do, and here's where I might negotiate, right? Will you go back for a half day? Will you do remote work, right? Doing your sort of baseline homework and needs ahead of time and having them on a piece of paper that you can actually look at. You can't see it, but I'm like looking at my pretend piece of paper here. That will help give you an anchor during that conversation so that you don't lose your track too often. Yeah.
Before we go back to Christina, I was just interviewed by the Harvard Business Review for this very topic, but from the other side, how can employers be better in being helpful and considerate and responsive to employee needs? And one piece of advice that if you are watching this and you are in a position to make change in the workplace as it comes to bereavement is to ask your employee what he or she may need. That in and of itself is radical, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe that employee would like to have more privacy when they come back to work. If it's in an in-person environment, maybe they're going to be triggered and they're going to want to cry for a moment, which of course is normal. So maybe it's just the work environment. Maybe there's a more private location that they can
Right.
work in just for a beat. And so I do think there's a duality of
Absolutely.
employee and employer.
Yeah, so that piece should be coming out in HBR relatively soon. I have a piece on Harvard Business Review. There are a few pieces out there. If you are an employer or you want to secretly educate your employer, there's a whole long conversation there about you can't really have one blanket bereavement policy because everybody is different. Some people want to come back to work and not talk about it at work because they just need to keep their shit together for a little while. Other people feel like, I don't want you to ignore it, but I don't want everybody coming to my desk every 5 minutes to offer their condolences. So you can't have a blanket policy, but what you can do is have a blanket policy that one person, the HR person, a team leader, will sit down and meet with the grieving person and ask, right? Like, you've never had to do this before, but do you know if you want people to talk to you about it? Do you know if you want sort of visiting hours at your desk where people can come by and say hello and welcome you back, right? We want to have policies in place that offer a roadmap for how do we respond and support to a grieving employee when they come back. This happens a lot with maternity leave, and somebody's baby dies and you come back from maternity leave with no baby and nobody knows what to do in that situation. No one, right? So when we talk about our plans for anybody returning to work as a grieving person or as an employer having somebody come back, there's no one answer. The important thing is, just as you brought up, whoever asked that question, is to enter into the conversation, right?
We can have a whole discussion about
Yes,
work
I
and
often
grief.
do.
Yes. Oh my gosh. All right, Christina, what else do you have?
How do you deal with friends who haven't acknowledged your loss?
This is a good one. This is so scripting is I feel like I spend most of my time running scripts for people, often in these situations. So it depends on the relationship with the person, right? There are some relationships that are, this sounds really mean, but there are some relationships that are worth having awkward conversations and some relationships that are not, right? So you don't have to have what I'm about to suggest. You don't have to have this kind of conversation with everyone. You get to make some choices about how awkward you want to get with somebody that you care about, right? So let's say that this is a mid-circle friend, not somebody super close, but not really a casual acquaintance. You can say things like, it feels really weird to me that you haven't acknowledged that my brother died last week. Is there a reason why you haven't brought it up? Right? Tone is everything, right? You don't want to be like, sometimes my tone leaks out of the side, but that's a really good question, is you're going to state what you've noticed and then ask, right? Is that intentional? Or can you tell me why you haven't brought it up? Sometimes, because of the way that we talk about grief in this culture, which is like, don't talk about it, don't upset somebody, your friend might be thinking, I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to make them sad. They have been misinformed that you are not always sad and that them bringing up your person's death is going to make you sadder. You know what I mean? We don't know why somebody hasn't acknowledged the loss unless we ask. Remember that that is for somebody who isn't hostile or abusive or going to cut you down and mock you. Those kinds of people, don't bother trying to get anything from them other than a solid boundary, right? But it's okay to say what's going on for you. It feels weird to me that you haven't brought this up. Can you tell me why you haven't? Again, their response is going to give you information. And based on that information, you can sort of decision tree in your head where you want to go with it. Does that make sense?
That's a great, wonderful.
Next, we have someone who grieves at a different rate or differently than their partner, and they're wondering how they can experience their grief differently but still support each other.
Yeah, that's a really good question. If we go back to those screen grabs from Speaking Grief, right, where you've got the daughter and the sister t-shirts being worn by those folks, everybody's going to grieve differently. The reality here is that even though one person died, everyone lost a different person, right? So going back to that screen grab, the woman wearing the daughter shirt lost one person, and the younger person who's wearing the sister shirt lost a different person, because we have different relationships. That means that everybody is always going to grieve differently, even before we get into different emotional styles. Going back to what we just said about the workplace thing, it's a very similar conversation. If you and your partner are grieving differently, you can have what we call a process conversation. Process conversations are when we talk about how we talk about things. So if I'm in a relationship with my partner and we lost a child, we can have a conversation where I say, you and I grieve very differently. Can we talk about ways we might support each other when we're not on the same page, right? That's a very different conversation than, why aren't you crying as much as I am? That, do you not care, right? Very different conversation. Process conversations happen not in the heat of the moment, but at a sort of more calm, settled time. And you make that request, like, you and I grieve very differently, or this is a really hard time for both of us. Can we sit down and have a conversation about what we need from each other? Because we're going to experience this very differently. Obviously, you want to sound like you and not me. But that's sort of the core of that conversation, acknowledging that differences are normal and healthy. And we want to know how to be there for each other, because this is hard. There's, I think it's in GQ. I have, there's an article, oh gosh, I might actually have the journalist wrong. I'm pretty sure the article is by Katie Hawk, Hawk, in GQ, and it's specifically about romantic partners and the different styles in grief. Christina, could you check? There were 3 or 4 articles that I did all in one batch, and I might have the journalist mismatched to the publication. But that is a really, really normal thing. And it's also very, very stressful, right? Any relationship is challenging because everybody brings their entire history and their personality and their communication styles and their emotional relational needs with them. The fact that any people get along for as long as they do is kind of stunning, but you add something as disruptive and world and life changing as intense loss into those relationships. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of patience and a lot of communication to survive those things.
Christina just added the GQ link.
Oh,
so
good.
Thank you so much, Christina. You are on it. So I
Excellent.
appreciate that. I do want to say, before we go on to the next question, we were focusing on the romantic relationship, but there's also one relationship that I have personal experience with that may be helpful to some who are listening, which is the sibling relationship when you lost the same set of parents. And so everything I'm about to say, I've talked through with my own brother. So I come from having this experience myself. But after we lost our mom, and then a few years later, our father, I was grieving very differently than my brother. And I wanted to talk about our parents. I wanted to go through and look at all their belongings and read all the letters. And I wanted to do all those things. It was an urgent need that I had to connect with them. My brother was processing his loss in a very different way. And that kept going on for a while, where I wanted to talk with my brother on our parents' birthdays. I wanted to talk with my brother specifically on the anniversary of their death, etc. And the phone call would never be from him to me. It was always me to him. And so it felt very uneven. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that he didn't love our parents any less. His grieving process was just different. And how that impacted me, and hopefully this is the part that will be most useful, is that for a while, it made me angry and resentful, and it made me feel even more lonely because I had already lost my parents, and now I felt I didn't even have my brother to share this experience of that loss with. And what it turned out to be is that I needed to get whatever I was searching for, perhaps from a friend, or perhaps from someone in a support group who was more of a stranger, but got what I needed, perhaps in a way that my brother wasn't prepared to offer. And so sometimes our greatest support can come from places that are not the closest to us. And so I just wanted to offer that different relationship based on my brother and me. But Christina, I digress. Go on to the next question.
Let me jump in
Yeah,
for 1 second. Let
of
me
course.
piggyback on that for 1 second.
Yeah.
Any relationship, any group. So this is your friend group, your siblings, your birth family, your chosen family, your workplace, your little family unit, like what Allison just described, that is going to happen for everybody, right? It's not a sign that you're doing grief wrong or that your relationships are in danger, or your friendships aren't good anymore. Like people have different styles. The thing to remember in all of those is one, that different ways of grieving are normal, and that you can open conversations about how you grieve and how you might support each other and how you might not. I love that you pointed out, Allison, that I was going to my brother for this really important thing that I needed, and he wasn't giving it to me. I do a once a month live Q&A with my patrons, which is actually happening this afternoon. And one of the things that I say there a lot is like, don't go to the furniture store looking for milk and being mad that they don't have milk, right? If you're going to somebody expecting a certain response and they can't or will not give it to you, stop going there looking for it. It doesn't mean that your need is wrong or that you're being too needy. It means that we need to find you the right place to get those needs met. And sometimes, as Allison said, that is a friend group, it's a support group. I think about the Refuge and Grief social media pages as the grievers community, right? The company of other grievers can sometimes give you what your own friends and family can't, right? So even my point here is everybody grieves differently. And if you can't get what you need from the people around you, your needs are not wrong. We just need to find another place for them to get met. Yeah.
You mentioned, by the way, your patrons. So you have a Patreon relationship, and so I did want to mention that. Part of that, there's two things I want to say. One is, what is the grief revolution? You talk about that, so please define that. And also, and this will make everyone's ears perk up, I am sure. You also have a double secret Instagram account.
Oh, right.
That only certain people know about the handle. So don't tell us what the secret account is, of course, because you'll have to find out what the revolution is. But please do help us understand what these opportunities are to connect with you in a more deep level.
Yeah, sure. So the Patreon community is Patreon. You can find it under Megan Devine instead of Refuge and Grief on Patreon. And we talk about there the grief revolution, and I talk about the grief revolution in a lot of places, not just Patreon, but we really do need to kick things over, right? All of these weird inherited ways that we've learned to talk about grief, they're wrong. There was an article that just came out in the Washington Post about prolonged grief disorder, and man, did that piss me off. You know, we are taught in grad school, in pop culture, in movies, in books, that if somebody is sad, the best thing to do, the healthiest thing to do, is to make them stop being sad immediately. And if they don't stop being sad immediately, they're doing it wrong. That message is so pervasive, and it causes so much unnecessary suffering, misunderstanding. For me, everything, every public health issue, every interpersonal issue, every challenge that we face as a human family stems from our misunderstanding and faulty response to grief. Everything. Now, I can talk about that forever and ever, so I'm going to try not to do that. But the grief revolution is really about, we need to kick over these old ways of understanding what it means to be human and recreate a way to be human, a way to respond to how hard it is to be human, along much kinder, more logical, and truly helpful lines. And if we don't do that, we're never going to get what we most want, which is to be cared for and to care for others. We can't do that if we treat grief as a problem to be solved, right?
And how can folks
Yeah.
find out about your secret Instagram?
I was just going to say, you say that like it's some magical thing. We've got so many things going on that the secret Instagram is so on Patreon. In order to access the like the once a month live Q&A that's happening today, it's the $10 and up membership level, And once you hit that $10 and up membership level, you get an invitation to the Instagram channel. Now, the Instagram channel these days is mostly making sure that you know when the Q&As are happening. You get announcements about, before anybody else, about any special events happening. Just blunt disclosure here, we have got so many projects that we're working on right now that we should probably change the language on that, because it makes it sound like it's a super exciting thing. And it hasn't been super exciting for a while because our team is so busy. But that is the place, like when you sign up at the $10 and up level on Patreon, you get access to me once a month for the live Q&A, which is honestly quite a deal, because I don't usually do any small scale events anymore because we are so busy. And then the super secret Instagram there is making sure that you know when things are happening, and you can submit questions if you can't be there for the actual live event. So it's just a nice little side door porch entrance into knowing when things are happening and getting your questions heard.
Well, I love it. I love it. Christina, what else do we have? I know we have 8 minutes left, and I promised everyone that we would get out on time, but I want to use the remaining time to do like lightning round questions for Megan.
Well, this is a big question, but it's come up a few times. It's about medical professionals and prolonged grief, and these medical professionals saying that their patients have been grieving for too long and offering them medication, and that's not what the patient wants. So do you have tips?
Yeah, I do. I will tell you that when that article came out in the Washington Post the other day about prolonged grief disorder, it's really hard for me not to do air quotes. Those are passive aggressive air quotes. We had so many DMs and so many comments asking me to talk about that. It will surprise no one to know that I have a really, really big issue with that. Those guidelines pathologize normal, healthy grief. And even if that diagnosis, that title, prolonged grief disorder, even if that were only used by therapists in their practices so that they could bill insurance, which is what that's for, that would still be a problem. Unfortunately, that's not the only way that a title like that or a name like that gets used. It doesn't just stay in the office walls. It goes out into Washington Post and other platforms. There's sort of a trickle down pathology that happens from the medical profession to the wider world. What that one article did in the Washington Post about prolonged grief disorder was to inform all of your family and friends that you, the griever, are screwing it up. You were supposed to be better 6 months ago. What's wrong with you? Maybe you need medication and you should see your doctor. That sort of pathology designation by press release does such damage to individual grieving people and to people who want to be supportive. It is horrendous, and I have a lot to say about it that we won't be able to get into here. As far as when you encounter that with your medical providers, and you most likely will, right? Little sidebar, I am coming out with some clinical training programs in early 2022 that will, like, there's a few that come out in early, and then there's some more that come out later. I am doing my best to educate the clinical and medical professionals to more humane and sane ways of meeting grief in their practices. They are also getting fed this prolonged grief disorder thing, though, that they're supposed to look at their patients and their clients and assess them as to how long they've been grieving. It's already rough out there trying to find a therapist if you're grieving, right? So here are some things that I would say. If your medical provider tells you that you have prolonged grief disorder, that you've been grieving too long, you can say things like, grief is a natural part of life, and it makes sense that I am sad a year and a half after my kid died. If you want to talk with me about managing my anxiety, I'm happy to do that, but I'm not going to medicate my grief, right? That's really clear language that you can use to advocate for yourself, right? There are things that we can do. Medicine, pharmaceuticals have their place. They're amazing, and they're not going to solve grief, right? So unfortunately, you may need to do some self-advocacy when you go into your providers. If you're not sure, if you've, let's say that you've had a relationship with a therapist for a while and you like them, you could actually bring that horrendous article into a session and say, have you seen this? Can we talk about this, right? that's a really good way to sort of drive the conversation and be in a leadership position in there, advocating for your own care. I will say that it's a very complex issue in that the clinical and medical worlds are driven by the medical industrial complex, which is a much bigger term for just the insurance companies. And they'll say that they needed a diagnosis in order to get your insurance to pay for care. That is not, that may be functionally true, but the problem is with the insurance machine and not with grief. Right. So when we say, oh, we needed a diagnostic code in order to get insurance companies to pay for care, that's nice in theory, but the way that actually happens on a lived human experience is we need to shame the grieving person and tell them they're doing it wrong so that we can be paid. And that is the wrong problem to be solving. Right. I can totally rant about this for a long time, so I'm going to zip it because we have 4 minutes left.
Yeah.
But yes, big issue.
The only thing I wanted to add to that, as we all know, is that grief is also exhausting and it can be debilitating, and you might not be in a position to want or have the ability to advocate for yourself in the way that you're just describing. There's two thoughts about that. Perhaps you can deputize someone who you trust to do that kind of advocacy for you with your permission. The second thing that I think you can do too is, while you're doing that work of advocating for yourself, know that there is power in that level of agency. And
Yes.
so many times we lose that sense of agency during a loss experience because loss is out of our control. So by advocating for yourself in the way that Megan is describing, it can actually be helpful in an emotional way too, because you are actually doing the work of getting yourself heard and the care that you need.
A sense of agency is really important. And I love that you brought up you can deputize somebody. This is great. There's a video that I have out about how to find a good grief therapist. And asking certain questions, like if you're looking for a new therapist or you're looking for a new doctor, you might get in touch with them and say, can you tell me your views on prolonged grief disorder? I just read about it in the Washington Post. Their response is going to give you a lot of information, right? If they come back and say, yes, grief should be over in 6 months, you know, you don't need to bother making an appointment to meet them. That action of sort of vetting potential providers, that is something that you can, I love the term you use, deputize. Very close to a loss event, you often have friends and family members who really want to be helpful. That is a job that they could take on if you trust them to do that, to say, here, you know, find me 5 grief therapists within walking distance from my house and ask them these questions, right? Like let somebody else do that field work.
And going back to the illustration, that cartoon video, when friends don't know how to help and they're dropping those unhelpful rainbows, this could be something that you're actually giving them that actually would be useful to you. So in the 1 minute we have left, I just want to, say thank you to Reimagine and Domani for Grief. Please check out all of Reimagine's events. Check out Domani for Grief's website and their Facebook community group that's growing. I highly recommend both. Megan Devine, you are divine, and we adore you. And again, your Instagram, your Twitter, your Facebook is all Refuge in Grief. And we are so delighted to have had the opportunity to speak with you today, to talk about speaking grief. This has been remarkable, and I am full of gratitude. And on the nose, I will say goodbye for now, and we will see you guys in November.